Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today, we're continuing our series, which we're doing in association with our friends at the DLD conference in Munich to celebrate their 20th year anniversary in January 2025 next year. We are talking today with Stephen Levy, who's spoken a number of times at the DLD conference, one of technology's leading journalists and writers. And as always in this series, I began by asking Stephen Levy what he remembers about January 2005.
In January 2005, I was a chief technology writer for Newsweek and just written a book about the iPod.
Does that seem a long time ago, Stephen? The iPod, that's an archaic device now, but of course it changed the world.
Yeah, the iPod changed the course of Apple. It sort of changed our relationship, I think, with digital technology. It became much more personal. My book was called The Perfect Thing. I thought this was like the apex. Of course, the iPod led to something else called the iPhone, which had a much bigger impact.
Did you ever imagine, I know it's hard in retrospect and it's hard to remember back, but did you ever imagine how profoundly transformative this little device could potentially be?
I didn't have to imagine how transformative it is. I was living it because I've covered technology for quite a while. I could kind of get how transformative this stuff was. That was a concept that hit me when I did my very first story about technology in the early 80s about computer hackers. I was blown away by this. I had thought computers were these inhuman, horrible things that turned us into numbers, but it was an exciting playground that you could see was going to change everyone's life, and that's why I started writing about it more and more.
One of the other people, Stephen, we've interviewed in this series is your, I guess he's a rival, John Markov, who was the chief tech correspondent, I think, of the New York Times at the time. And we talked to John about his relationship with Steve Jobs. What kind of relationship did you have?
Well, first, John's not my rival. He's a
colleague.
He's a
and a
colleague.
Friend, I'm sure.
He's a colleague and a really close friend. As a matter of fact, soon after I started writing about this stuff, everyone told me, you got to meet this guy, John Markov. He's like you. And he was writing for a trade publication then. And on a trip to Palo Alto, I made a point of meeting John, and we've been great friends ever since. Along with John, I was one of the very few journalists who did have this deep relationship with Steve Jobs. As a matter of fact, when Steve was dying, at one point, John suggested that the two of us go and spend some time with him. No agenda, just like hang out. And we did that. We went, and Steve wasn't going to the office regularly then, but he agreed to meet us there, and we went to his office, the empty space at Apple headquarters, because he was on medical leave or whatever, and we just spent like an hour and a half with him, just talking. The elephant in the room was this was going to be our last big conversation.
In our conversation with John Markov, he talked about how similar in some ways and how different in others Jobs is with contemporary titans like Elon Musk. What's your take on that? What can Jobs teach us about our current situation? Some people might even say predicament, where multi-billionaires like Musk have so much power.
Steve wasn't into publicly exercising his political views. He was a supporter of, in particular, Bill Clinton, and they became friendly. And he was weirdly private about a lot of his life. His focus was really on the products and how the products were going to change people. He wasn't using the products as like a means to any kind of end. It was just delivering the best thing that he could build that would be amazing, and he was incredibly focused on that.
Did he have a plan in his mind from the iPod to the iPhone, do you think? Did he know exactly what he was doing?
I think when Steve came back to Apple in 1997, he wanted just to revive it. He wanted to get back to some basic principles that had worked in the first stage of the company with the Apple II and particularly the Macintosh. And he felt it had drifted away from those principles, and really the creativity that had been the center of the company wasn't there anymore. I remember he called me in when they were about to release the iMac in 1998, and explained to me how he felt that Apple was like this girlfriend you had who'd fallen on hard times. Maybe she's like some junkie that you have to rescue. And he went in and did that, and sort of did the thing with design, and that led to the question of what's the ceiling for Apple products, because everything else works with the other operating system. So we decided that we have to build out our operating system and have things that are, for our users, for our community, that can push technology, and that's where the iPod came out. And then you realized that could be good for everyone, and they did it for the Windows, and that opened up that possibility that Apple can create just like a general interest consumer product, and then that really led to the phone. And that's, obviously something that, has carried Apple to great heights, even years after Steve died.
Did he ever imagine, though, that this little device would so dramatically change the world, much more than anything else he'd ever invented?
You mean the phone?
Yeah.
No one really knew how big the phone would be. I mean, he knew it would be a massive product, but when it came out, it had a limited number of applications that ran directly on the phone, and he felt that people would write like web programs that could run on a phone. But the power of being really deeply integrated was something that you got a glimpse of in some of the native applications, like maps, for instance. But when he opened it up a year later, that's when it really went into overdrive and transformational, because you kind of do the kinds of products that no one could ever do before, like something like Uber that could use all the different things of the phone, like the tracking and the graphics and the web and the phone and network, and to create this thing where this car would magically appear and know where you were and know where to go. That used all the aspects of the phone that you could tap into. So really, it's kind of ironic that the phone, it's called the phone, but it's like one of the least remarkable things about the iPhone.
Are we living today in late 2024, early 2025, when DLD celebrates its 20th anniversary? Are we still living in Steve Jobs' world, when you walk around the streets and everyone's glued to their phones, when you travel on public transportation and everyone's looking at their phones? Is this Steve Jobs' world, Steve?
When I wrote his obituary, which was something, I hoped, I wouldn't have to write for much longer. I ended it by saying that Steve was known for what was called the reality distortion field. He would make all the people around him believe his vision, even if it didn't necessarily correspond with reality. And I said that, Steve's reality distortion field became reality, and we're all living in it.
What else was happening in 2005? You've written books since then on Google or Facebook.
Well, let me give you one more story about Steve.
Yeah.
This has to do with DLD. So I went to DLD in 2007, and that was, just a couple weeks after Steve announced the iPhone, and then people were talking about it, of course. And
that was the first time you went to DLD.
That was the first time I went to DLD. And I really had to make sure that I make my connection to get back, because the day after I was flying back, Newsweek was going to host a lunch with Steve Jobs. They did a very tiny press tour. Maybe they went to like 2 or 3 places in New York City, maybe us in the Wall Street Journal or something. And I was the host. We were going to have a lunch with all the top editors at Newsweek, and he was going to show all the editors the iPhone, and we were going to get our hands on it. And I went to DLD, had a great time, and then went to the airport, and it was just snowing. And I thought, oh my God, if I don't get out of here, the Steve Jobs lunch is going to happen, and I'm not going to be there. But fortunately, we did take off, and I did land, and we did host Steve Jobs, and it was kind of amazing. He came with a few iPhones, and he split up the groups of editors into, in little packets of 4 people or whatever, and each one had an iPhone, and or someone from Apple to guide us through how to use it. And that was really the first time any of us, of course, had gotten our hands on the iPhone. You couldn't use it much when he had done the announcement in San Francisco a couple weeks before, and everyone was like totally blown away.
So back to the broader tech landscape in 2005. As I said, you've written books on Google and on Facebook. You're as familiar as anyone with that period. Looking back, what were the most salient developments? Do you believe in Tim O'Reilly's Web 2.0 term? Is that helpful to making sense of tech in 2005?
Well, that was definitely what was happening. We did a cover of in Newsweek. I remember the choice for the cover was going to be either MySpace or Flickr. And I said, don't do those MySpace guys. And I got Stuart Butterfield and Katarina Fake on the cover of Newsweek for that. And that was a big thing. But then people were talking about the phone. Would Apple come out with a phone? What would happen with that? People understood that was going to be happening. And the other big thing was happening was the dominance of Google. It was just rising. And I had been thinking, in 2005, gee, should I do a book about Google? And in 2006, I took this trip around the world, led by Marissa Mayer, of these young future leaders of Google, visiting, their outposts around the world. We stopped off in Tel Aviv and saw Yossi, actually. And then I realized I should write a book about Google from the inside, which I did. I started that book in probably 2008, and then published it in 2011.
Do you see Google, Stephen, as the dominant tech company of the last 20 years, in the same way perhaps as between 85 and 2005 Microsoft was the dominant company?
Yeah, definitely. I think through the 90s, Microsoft was the big company, and it was one which I did a lot of reporting on. And I would go to Redmond, and we would go through these buildings. Their buildings are kind of like tombs, and be squinting at the map and building things out. Where do we go to, like building 34A, ZT, and and you go into the room, and there'd be some engineer, banging away, and you try to talk about this new product he designed, whatever. And of course, everyone, it was Microsoft's work. And weirdly, I just wrote a story for Wired about Microsoft's revival. So maybe Microsoft wants to be the company of the 2020s. Who knows? But the time after that, the early 2000s, definitely Google, and through that next decade, Google was, I'd say, the flagship company of technology. Search was so dominant and so transformational, and AI. They were always, pushing AI. So obviously, Google, and then coming up behind there's like Facebook. As social media made its imprint on us. Can everything we talk about, every era of technology is really based on the previous one. It's not like one era begins, stop, from scratch, another era happens. There's like the chip, then there's the PC, and then there's the internet, and then there's mobile, and then there's social, and now there's AI. And each one doesn't happen unless all the other things are happening and still happening. And that's what's so fascinating about covering this. You go on to the next thing, and each one has like a bigger and bigger impact, and the small groups of people, because this infrastructure is in place, can like move the world by the next advance.
Your books have done extremely well, but if there is a criticism, Stephen, you know this, some people have suggested you've been a little too kind, particularly to Google. The zeitgeist has shifted dramatically since 2005. Most of the books now coming out about big tech are quite critical. Do you in any way regret not being more critical in your books of companies like Google and Facebook?
I'm going to push back against that. I think I have criticism of the companies in there. My book about Facebook, which came out in 2020, had the F symbol, its logo, like smashed up. When I showed it to advanced copy of the cover, to Chris Cox, one of the top executives at Facebook. It was called Facebook back then, and he just like groaned. And the whole last third of the book was about that. I do believe that just to prove that you're a tough journalist, you shouldn't just ignore the achievements the company made. There's just like no way around it. Google search was transformational. It's an amazing story how they built a company like that. And if later on they made moral compromises, you write about that too. With Facebook, a guy in a dorm room connected over half the world. Holy cow, not to like write about how that happened in a way where you acknowledge that that's a heck of an achievement, is just like stupid. That's bad journalism. And then you go and talk about how they screwed it up.
You had remarkable access to Mark Zuckerberg, your book about Facebook. What do you remember about him? Is he, or was he, different from Jobs and from contemporary titans like Musk? What is singular about Zuckerberg, and how does that tell us about the 20 years between 2005 and 2025, which are in many ways Zuckerberg's years?
Yeah, well, these people came from their particular generations, right? So Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, baby boomers. They came late baby boomers. The Google guys, X, Generation X. But Zuckerberg, was someone who grew up, with AOL Instant Messenger, and he had access to, computers from the time, he was a peach buzz, 10-year-old, and that's the way he thought. That's the way he lived and breathed. He also had this weird sort of classical world idea of conquering, which had a lot to do with the way he grew Facebook, and just a person who saw what he wanted and got it, but he also had an instinct for how people would use things. So, and a different kind of person. The first time I met him, again, 2006 was like a big year for me. I met him at Esther Dyce's conference, and it took me 10 minutes to get a single word out of him. I would ask him a question, he would like stare at me. And I said, what the heck's going on here? And,
you were used to Jobs, so you couldn't get a word in.
That's right, yeah. Well, Jobs, he would push out you, right? So you interviewed Jobs, he had something to sell you, and he would just go, and you would have to divert him in order to get your question in. Bill Gates is another guy. He also sometimes would like stonewall you, or you'd ask him a question, and then he'd talk about something else, and you figure, what, didn't he hear my question? What's going on? And then 20 minutes later, he would answer the question. But it was a challenge. You'd say something that had a minor factual error, and he'd jump on you. And if you weren't careful, the next 10 minutes would be like you kind of like saying, yeah, I misspoke that, but X, Y, and Z. But he would just camera you at it, right? He would just like jump on you and seize on that. And I learned how to steer a conversation past that or make a joke about it or whatever. And Zuckerberg, eventually he needs trust. You have to gain his trust before you really get a really great conversation from him.
It's ironic, given the role of Facebook, perhaps in today's crisis of trust. Another of your colleagues and friends, David Kirkpatrick, another of New York's leading tech writers, who's a friend of mine, is going to be in this series. He wrote a book about Facebook, I think it came out before yours, that was quite initially bullish on the promise of Facebook to connect the world and help democracy, particularly in the Arab Spring. He's changed his mind quite dramatically since writing that book. Your book was less bullish, I think, on Facebook. It came out later. But what's your take on this narrative about Facebook making the world a better place, connecting people, helping democracies around the world?
Well, it's clearly, there's been a lot of damage done. So, also a lot of good. I mean, people use it for a reason. And not just people who are trolls or misinformation spreaders. I mean, families use it, they keep in touch, for sort of, mundane pedestrian uses. It has its uses, and it's sort of, and Instagram, of course, has grown over 1 billion people, and it's evolved, to something quite different than it started out with. And, you could argue about whether that's good or not, but if you're an influencer, it's like terrific, right? So it sort of pushed the world into that era. But on the other hand, terrific damage. You have to balance it out, and the company could have done a lot more to mitigate the damage. That's where the problem is. The technology is the technology. The opportunity the technology presents is the opportunity. It's up to the creators and distributors of the technology to make sure it's being responsibly used. And clearly, Facebook, when it was Facebook, and I don't see much improvement in Meta, it failed to do that. That was a failure on their part.
There's some critics of Facebook who have argued that the reason for that was Sheryl Sandberg, who of course was very senior at Google. She brought the Google business model to Facebook, made it very successful. Given that you've written books on Google and Facebook, you're all too familiar with the two companies' business models. Sherry Turkle described, not Sherry Turkle, Shoshana Zuboff describes this as surveillance capitalism. What's your take on both Sandberg and the business models of Google and Facebook? Is this surveillance capitalism, Stephen?
Well, I mean, it's, surveillance capitalism is a term to describe what things evolved to. What Sheryl did was sort of apply the age-old principles of advertising, to new technology. And it turned out that, the uses could be very dark. And it really, I think, was up to the company to steer it away from that. And they just didn't do it. They didn't pay enough attention to it, right? So when you add targeting to the information gathering that the phone has and how much it knows about you, right? They say, one researcher found that, like, with 10 likes, they know you as well as a casual friend, and 30 likes knows you as well as a close friend, and the 100 likes or whatever, it knows you as well as your spouse does, right? So when you have that kind of intimacy extracted from you, you have responsibility in how you use it. But when the money's flowing, you feel, hey, my responsibility is to shareholders. I'm going to keep going on this, or to build the company. So I think it started out by Sheryl thinking, wow, this is a great way to sell advertising. And as it became clear that there was a dark side of it, that's when you morally should clamp down. But in business, morals come in conflict with what the point of the business is. So that's why I guess Oshana's term is so effective, because that's the way capitalism is. And
Well, some capitalism is less surveillant than others. You go and buy a car.
Capitalism. I mean, the big underlying question when you talk about criticizing technology and and the power of billionaires is that it's sort of late stage capitalism. That's what capitalism inevitably evolves to unless it's regulated. So I think we're seeing that a lot of the criticisms of the technology companies really are the criticisms of the economic structure by which they apply the technology.
Stephen, you began this conversation by noting that you were at Newsweek in 2005. You're no longer there. You and I are doing this conversation at the very, very nice Condé Nast offices, One World Trade Center. We have a magnificent view behind you of the East River.
That's the Hudson River.
Sorry, the Hudson River. What's the story of your career in the last 20 years? You're one of the few people still with jobs in mainstream media, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, I love writing, long-form features. I do other things. I do a weekly newsletter, which is also a lot of fun. So, through my career, I've almost always written a column, but also pursued big features and big interviews. At Wired, we have this thing called the Big Interview, and we've done all kinds of people, and the biggest names. But to have an opportunity to do it is great. I loved working at Newsweek when it was Newsweek, and because it had this, people cared about what was in it. They cared what was on the cover, and I was able to just be all over the industry and and if something in my world like Google pops, I could do a cover about it, and write 5,000 words or whatever, and that would make a difference, and people would notice that, and it'll be a breakthrough for the company. At Wired, where I moved, after I took a buyout at Newsweek in 2008, we still do this long-form journalism. Literally, just the day before we're taping this interview, I dropped a 9,000-word story about Microsoft. How did Microsoft get back to be one of the most valuable companies in the world? We thought it was fading. And, I had the freedom and the resources to do this story over a period of months. I traveled 3 times to the West Coast. And, it's important that some people are doing this kind of journalism. An influencer or a podcaster can't do that. You can't get that kind of reporting unless you have an infrastructure that's based on supporting a long, expensive story like that with beautiful graphics. It's in print, it's on the web, you can find it anywhere. And, I'm lucky to be able to work for one of the few places that still does that, and it goes through multiple editing drafts, and gets every sentence gets fact checked. So that journalism is endangered, and we'd all lose a lot if it were gone.
Yeah, I'd forgotten, Stephen, before we had this conversation, that you and I don't even know if you'll remember this. It was back in 2007. I had a book out called Cult of the Amateur, and I got a call from you. You were at Newsweek, and you said to me, "I want to cover you, and it's going to be a big deal." And it was a big deal. It certainly helped me get some visibility. So you, as a big-time journalist, you have the power, and you didn't manifest it in an unpleasant way, but you have the power to make people and sometimes even break them.
I don't think of it that way. I'm telling stories. I'm telling the stories of our time. I don't think about like raising them. And sometimes it's good. One thing I do in my newsletter actually is I report it a lot, and a company will say, "Hey, we're going to be announcing in a few weeks, and we'd like you to write the first story about us." And I don't do stories so much in the news section. But I'll say I could cover you in my newsletter. The anchor of the newsletter is called Plain Text, and the anchor of the newsletter is an essay. It could be 1,200 words called The Plain View, And I could, pretty much explain what a company's about and launch it. And sometimes a company will even say, yeah, we were going to launch on a Tuesday, but we'll launch on a Friday when your newsletter comes out, so we can have you write the story, because I've gotten a reputation, whether deserved or not, I think it's deserved, of being able to actually explain what something does and, and what it means in clear terms. Places find it useful for me to talk about that. And I'm happy to give those companies exposure. If there's maybe a little issue in that the company challenges they're going to face as they launch and try to build their company, I'll point them out. But it's good to be able to use my audience and reach to call attention to things that I are paying attention to. Of course, I turn down the huge majority of companies that ask me to do that stuff.
You mentioned reputation. It's also trust. People trust Stephen Levy. That's why you're still one of the very few journalists to get these 9,000-word projects on big companies like Microsoft. And around you, you're one of the last traditional trusted journalists around you. Of course, the industry has been decimated. More and more journalists are losing their jobs. They're going on Substack or Instagram or TikTok. How profound has that shift been in journalism, not just in tech journalism, but in all forms of journalism over the last 20 years?
Yeah, well, journalism obviously has had a terrible time over the past 20 years. There's many fewer reporters. A lot of great publications have disappeared or have been sold. I'm thinking my former employer Newsweek at at fire sale prices, and what they are now aren't what they used to be. I remember at Newsweek, that trip that I took with the Google people, we paid our own expenses. We weren't going to let Google pay for my trip, and it cost like $14,000 for my travel. And a few years later, the magazine sold for $1. So,
and that $14,000 back in 2008, that's a lot of money.
No, it's a lot of money. And there's not many places now that will say, oh, okay, here's your expenses for the story. It's $14,000, no problem. I couldn't have gone on that trip. Most places. It'd be interesting if I asked my editor, Katie Drummond, for $14,000 to do a story like that.
She'd probably drop dead.
Or kill me. But but it is, there was some excess in those periods. I remember at Newsweek, people will talk about even like the fatter times beforehand in the 70s and the 80s, where people racked up huge expense accounts, and they had literally some of these places carts going through the offices on closing day with booze, and every Friday night we'd go up to the top of the week, we called our dining room, and they served us like a dinner while we waited for our editors to go through the story, and stayed at great hotels, and you could say, well, okay, journalism doesn't have to work that way, but it does cost money to have the very best journalism from the very best journalists, and that business model doesn't work as well for a lot of places. I think the Substack model, I just can't see it as sustainable. When you subscribe to Wired, you get me, you get other great journalists, all in one package. You get a print magazine, and and we're covering all sorts of stuff. And Substack, for the price of a Wired subscription, actually much more than a Wired subscription, you just get one journalist, and that journalist perspective and how great it is, there's other ones. So what do you want to do? Subscribe to like 50 journalists at $100 a year? So how can that work?
You also work with Medium. It's a company that isn't one of the great successes of the last 20 years. Do you have regrets, Stephen? Are there stories you've missed? Choices made or not made in your career that you wish you'd done?
I joined Medium in 2014. I thought it would be interesting and really an omission in my career if I didn't get to experience what it was like from one of the internet companies from the inside. And I had the idea to build a publication from inside Medium. I thought the plan had a lot of, their vision had a lot of promise. And I started a publication called Back Channel. And, you know, it worked really well. I mean, my journal. So I didn't miss stories on it. I was able to do some pretty big stories at Medium. You know, I was the editor. I could say, my executive editor would call me out a lot of times, and I would listen to her. But, you know, I had final say. So I did some pretty big stories for Medium. Ultimately, you know, long story short, we went to Condé Nast when our boss decided he didn't want to run these kinds of publications anymore. A year later, he changed his mind, started new ones. And then we got sucked back into Wired, so here I am. But since I've been involved with Wired literally since the beginning, I wrote the cover story of the second issue, it's home to me, and I'm really comfortable and happy here.
Ed Williams was behind Medium, I guess he still is.
Not so much, he's not the CEO anymore.
Well, he certainly put a lot of his own money in. He's also co-founder of Twitter. Do you think that, I always thought that perhaps in some senses he had a sense of guilt about Twitter, so he invested in long-form journalism at Medium. Is there any truth to that?
Well, I think he had a sense of, he felt unhappy about the way his time there turned out. You know, I mean, he lost his job. He didn't get to, carry Twitter to its promise. In 2009, they thought, the 1 billion users was going to be a slam dunk. I don't think they ever got past the 500 million users. He saw, he was genuinely interested in quality, stuff writing on the internet, whether by professionals or, people who were finding their voice and wanted to communicate something. So I thought Medium, had a lot of promise. It didn't work out that way, but I spent, a couple of the most fulfilling years of my career working in that company, building something. I never worked harder, and I never had more fun. So God knows I don't regret it.
AI, Stephen, again, you don't need me to tell you this, has always been the next big thing, probably ever since you began in tech writing 40 years ago. Have you been surprised with the way it actually is the next big thing now, or is the new thing?
Well, yeah, you're right. AI is something, from the very beginning. My first book, Hackers, I went to MIT, and a lot of the original hackers wound up at the AI lab in the 60s at MIT. And I hung around there and got to know Marvin Minsky and the other people in the field, and always followed the field. It was always X years out before we'd really see dramatic changes. But things kind of came out of left field, and the new, machine learning, deep learning approach that was invented really in the early 2000s by Jeff Hinton and crew, and even then, even as they started to be integrated into stuff in the 2000s, it really didn't take off into overdrive until after the Transformers discovery at Google, when we see things like ChatGPT, right? And that was a turning point. And even people in the field didn't think it was going to go that far that fast. And it really thrust upon us all the concerns that used to be like bullshit dorm room kind of conversations about, oh, what if a computer was smart enough to do this, or we could talk to it, or it could be like a human companion, and you'd see it in movies, and you'd talk about, what if that happened? We were there. Holy cow. And, so this is transformational. It's big. I think it's the biggest thing at least since the internet. And is something that humans, I'd like to say are going to have to grapple with, but probably it's going to be thrust upon us, and we'll be dealing with it as opposed to grappling with it. And so covering that has been the focus of my journalism for the last probably a couple of years, and I think it's going to continue to be so for the next couple of years.
There's a lot of ironies about AI. As you noted, Google developed the transformer technology, but then they invented it or they authored it. It was a white paper, but they never developed it, and it got developed by OpenAI and Sam Altman. This rather circular and almost haphazard nature of both the technology and the business side, what does that tell us about the narrative of technology? Are there always unintended consequences? Nothing is ever inevitable, is it, Stephen?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'd call it haphazard. I think basically unpredictable is probably a better way. You don't know where the next breakthrough is going to come from. And obviously, the transformer people, the 8 authors, I did a story where I interviewed all 8, talked about how the thing came about. None of them are at Google now, but you have to say it's a good thing that Google supported that kind of research, and transformer-based models are central to Google now. So even though they didn't exploit the opportunities first that happened, as you say, in OpenAI, it's something that Google will benefit from, and Google will benefit from breakthroughs that come from out of Google over the next few years. So you could say it evens out. Look, this stuff is unstoppable. Again, from the original Big Bang of the chip, one thing happened after another, and I don't think you could, say if this team at Google wasn't there, we wouldn't have, AI models that can, perform like we see now with GPT-4 or Claude or whatever. That probably would have happened in some other way. We're strapped into the roller coaster, and it's a challenge for us to be able to kind of determine where it is. We're kind of on a roller coaster where the ride's begun, but the last part of it hasn't been built yet. And we're kind of hoping that it'll be built before we get to that point.
We certainly are, Stephen. Obviously, AI is a huge story. When we look back, historians of the 2040s, when they look back at the 2020s, historians of tech, what do you think we don't get that will become a big deal in the next 20 years?
Well, no, most historians may well be artificial intelligences, and they'll be much better than I am at perceiving patterns in history. I think I don't think I am smart enough to perceive like the hidden consequences of our time.
What would you guess?
Hmm?
I mean, biotech is obviously enormously influential. Crypto remains powerful in its own way.
Yeah, I read a book about crypto.
What are you bullish on that most people aren't in 2025?
I'm bullish that humans will hang on to the value of human connection. I mean, the one thing that AI can't do is connect human to human. It could fake it pretty well, and it's going to be able to fake it much better. But ultimately, we seek connection. We seek connection not with digits, but with, our flesh and blood companions in this journey. Whether they're people we know in our circles, or family members, or loved ones, or friends, or people with the capability, creative people with the capability to make their consciousness speak to ours. And that's what I hope for. I hope that we don't lose that, and something within us is able to understand when something we read or see or hear connects with us on a gut human level, as opposed to a super sophisticated breakdown of what is going to push our buttons. So I think that'll happen. I hope that'll happen, and a lot depends on that happening.
Stephen, finally, you've been very generous with your time. You've been lucky enough to cover tech, write about tech in its glory years, where it's dominated society, shaped our politics, our economics, our identity. It's hard, of course, to look forward to go 20 years hence, maybe when DLD will be celebrating its 40th anniversary. And I'm not going to ask you for which technology is going to be more important than others, but do you think in 2045 the world we will live in will be as tech-saturated, as tech-centric as it is today?
We recall tech, we refer to tech as like the most recent version of tech. If you look at our world 20 years ago, and if you look at our world 40 years ago, it was like drenched in tech, but the things we called tech were things that, eventually we just became like a part of our world. So what looks like new and shiny now, we don't even think of it as technology. I mean, like wheels are technology, right? At one point, you could imagine, the rollout of the wheels, so to speak.
Or electricity, as another.
Yeah, like electricity. You look back then, and people were looking at it the same wonder. It was kind of like AI of its time. The way that people talked about it, how transformational it be, and it made kind of a big difference. But we don't think of it now as tech. And I think in 20 years, a lot of things we're thinking now as cutting edge tech, won't be thought of that way because they'll be so integrated into it. The whole time I've been reporting has been a time of lost adjectives and prefixes, right? So like what used to be called E this or E that, we just call it that, right? E-commerce is commerce, right? The iMac is like Mac, right? And the iMac for internet. It used to be called, internet this, internet that. It's just that. So I think that'll happen. I also push back against saying that that 20 years ago or 40 years ago was the golden age of tech. You could argue that we're in the golden age of tech now. With like AI and the other stuff happening. It's Stuart Brand told me once, because I was complaining to him in the early 80s. I said, boy, just a few years ago, Apple was getting underway. What a great story that was. I wasn't writing about technology yet. I was like just starting my magazine writing career. If I had been out there and gotten to Apple and wrote a magazine story about Apple in like 1978, how awesome would that have been? He said, Stephen, listen, people are going to come to you and ask you what it was like now, And sure, he was right. I think if you're a starting writer now, you're starting to write about AI and these companies and OpenAI and Anthropic and how Google and Microsoft are competing. People will come to you at a certain point, or maybe AI reporters, and they'll ask you what it was like in the mid-2020s. So we're still early.
Well, Stephen Levy, they never prefixed you, always Stephen Levy rather than I Levy or E Levy. Real honor to have you on the show in association with DLD, celebrating their 20th anniversary in January of next year. Thank you so much, a pleasure, and I hope we'll do this again, certainly in 20 years and certainly sooner as well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll see you in 20 years, Andrew. Thanks a lot.